They said a maid could never change a billionaire, until the night he found her asleep on the nursery floor, cradling the only thing he couldn't buy back, his daughter's peace. If this story touches you, please consider subscribing for more healing tales. Thank you for being here. Snow pressed its silent face against the windows of Greenwood Estate, dulling the world to a hush. Beyond the wrought iron gates, the suburbs north of Boston were mid-blizzard, an ocean of white. Street lamps haloed and distant. The pines bowed like old men in prayer. Inside, the mansion breathed with the soft clicks of radiators and the measured whir of vents. It was luxurious, yes, but also empty in the way an unopened concert hall is empty. Perfect acoustics awaiting a note that never comes. Grace Miller did not belong to the marble and the hush. At least, that's what the house would have said if houses spoke. 28, sensible shoes, a cardigan with a mended elbow, her badge clipped to her collar. Grace, household staff. But the name had always been a small rebellion against her past. Grace. It didn't promise power. It promised gentleness that could lift a weight no hand could lift. She had meant to straighten the toys, to fold the duck-pattern blanket, to wipe the fogged patch of window where a small hand had tried to draw a sun. The nursery felt warmer than the rest of the house, more human, as if it remembered laughter and soft feet. A pale nightlight glowed from the wall outlet, shaped like a star, and the ceiling mobile spun with the faint draft of the vents. Paper moons, paper boats, a paper bear. Sophie's breathing was ragged, the kind of sleep that isn't sleep, a long argument between exhaustion and fear. Shh, Grace whispered, easing down beside the crib. One arm through the rails, palm cupped beneath the child's shoulder blade, the other hand smoothing curls from a damp forehead. Night after night, since she'd arrived 2 weeks ago, the pattern had been the same. Bedtime stories dissolving into sobs, lullabies collapsing into silence that broke like thin ice, tiny fists clenching the sheet at the first hint of a shadow moving on the wall. Tonight had been worse. The storm had given the windows a voice, a low keening, a thrum in the panes, and somewhere above, in the third-floor office where the lights never seemed to go out, Ethan Blake worked. He was always working, chasing down wind turbine contracts and a battery patent he believed could change the grid forever. Grace. The child's eyes, hazel and fever bright, met hers. I don't like the wind. I know, honey. I know what it sounds like. She lowered her voice. It sounds bigger than the house, but it can't come in here. You're safe. Sophie chewed her lip. Where's Daddy? Upstairs. He's reading big papers. The answer worked better than working did. He asked me to watch over you. That was true, in a procedural, heartless kind of way. Margaret Thompson, the senior housekeeper, had said it on Grace's first day. You'll report to me. Mr. Blake will hardly notice you if you do your job right. Grace had nodded, though the words had scraped something in her. The memory of other houses, other rules, other rooms where she'd been expected to be both invisible and indispensable. Sophie's sleep tried again, failed again. Grace hummed nothing in particular, the kind of half-melody children always seem to understand without being taught. On the rug near the crib, a plush rabbit stared up from the slant of its stitched smile. Grace reached through the bars, found the crib latch, and paused. The manual had said sleep training is critical. Margaret had said consistency matters. But Sophie's small chest hitched like an engine that couldn't turn over. The shadows were too big tonight, the wind too loud. Okay, Grace breathed, deciding. Okay. She slid the crib side down, lifted Sophie against her, and sank to the rug with the child draped across her shoulder like a weary bird. The floor was not cold. The rug was thick and kind under her knees. She leaned her back against the wall, arranged the duck-pattern blanket over both of them, and made her body into what the manuals never mentioned: a shore. Sophie's breath steadied, lengthening into sleep that finally accepted itself. The star nightlight made a small galaxy near the baseboard. The mobile turned. The storm kept speaking, but its vowels blurred at last. Grace's eyes burned from the day and a decade. There had been so many floors in her life: the linoleum of group homes, the thin carpet of temporary rooms, the tile of clinics where she'd done double shifts to afford community college classes she never finished. When you grow up in foster care, you learn to love the floor, she thought with a crooked half-smile. It's the only thing that doesn't move under you. She had promised herself that the next child who needed a shore would not be left to wade alone. At some point, minutes, an hour, the doorknob turned. The door didn't swing, it detonated. The light from the hall washed over them like a police flood lamp. He stood there. Ethan Blake, the name behind the headlines and the prospectus covers, shoulders like squared granite, jaw set to a number he never let drop below 10. In his charcoal sweater and black slacks, he looked like an apology no one would ever hear, except for his eyes, which did not apologize. They measured. They cut. "What?" he said, each letter crisp as glass. "Are you doing?" Grace pushed herself up on an elbow, kept the other arm wrapped around Sophie. The child stirred but didn't wake. "She couldn't sleep, Mr. Blake. The storm—" "You are on my nursery floor." He crossed the room in 3 strides. "With my daughter, asleep." Grace swallowed. "I wasn't asleep." "Then you're worse than I thought." He knelt, and the scent of his cologne, oak and something darker, cut through the powdery sweetness of the room. He slid an arm beneath Sophie with a practiced, impatient efficiency. The child's hand, reflexively, tightened in the fabric of Grace's cardigan. "Please," Grace said, soft. "Don't." Ethan lifted. Sophie woke completely and wailed. The sound ricocheted like a fire alarm through steel beams. She arched away from him, both hands flying toward Grace's neck, small fingers splayed in blind panic. "No!" she cried, shuddering. "No, no, 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 Gracie!" It would have been so easy for Grace to let Ethan win, to surrender the child and the moment and her job. But the floor was the floor, and the storm was the storm, and Sophie's fear made a sound Grace knew too well, the sound of a heart searching for its one familiar thing. "Give her back to me," Grace said, and it surprised them both how steady her voice was. "Just for 2 minutes." Ethan's eyes flashed. "You don't give orders in my house." "I'm not." She kept her gaze on Sophie's face, not his. "I'm telling you what calms your daughter." "Calm?" He laughed once, and it wasn't kindness. "My staff is here to follow instructions, not invent them. There are protocols, sleep training, schedules. I have specialists." Sophie gulped air like she was drowning. "Gracie!" Grace reached up, palms open. "Hey, honey." "I'm here." For a heartbeat that felt like a century, nothing moved. Then something older than pride tightened Ethan's jaw. He lowered Sophie. The child flowed into Grace's arms as if the space had been carved for her exactly. The siren cry collapsed into a hiccuping sob, then into the fragile hush after rain. The room measured this new silence as if to admit it was the right shape. "I see," Ethan said, quiet and edged. He stood, tugged his cuffs once, a man reassembling his armor. "So you've decided the rules don't apply to you?" Grace adjusted the blanket around Sophie's legs, the way a mother might, the way a person does when they remember being cold. I decided she needed presence more than procedure. That's all. Presence. His mouth twisted on the word. Is that what we call it now? Grace looked up. This close, she could see the fatigue scored like pencil shading at the corners of his eyes, the grief that had not found its language. If she were unkind, she might have thought loneliness looks expensive. She refused herself the cruelty. I'm sorry you walked in on this, she said. I know how it looks. Do you? He took a step toward the window and the snow smearing white across the glass. Because what I see is a member of my household staff violating boundaries I set, lying on the floor of a room where my daughter is supposed to learn self-soothing, after I've paid absolute top-tier experts to build a regimen that will give her stability. Grace felt the old humiliation lift its head, the quick heat in the face, the instinct to apologize until you've apologized your own voice to death. She let the feeling pass. Stability and comfort can be friends, she said quietly. They don't have to be enemies. He turned back. And this, he said, flicking a hand at the rug, is comfort? It's a start. Thunder, or maybe just wind, rolled against the eaves. For a long minute, the only sound was Sophie's breathing thinned to a whisper. The paper boats circled each other above, light as prayer. Where did you learn any of this? Ethan asked finally, not with curiosity, with suspicion. Grace smoothed the child's hair with a tenderness that belonged to no job description. In the places where no one learned it for me, she said. Foster homes, night shifts, waiting rooms. People keep breathing even when no one knows what to do. Sometimes all you can do is hold the shoreline. Something flickered behind his eyes. It might have been recognition. It might have been the first micro crack in a dam he had convinced himself was made of stone. He looked at Sophie then, really looked, at the loosened fists, the unfurrowed brow. He rubbed a hand along the back of his neck, and his voice came out low. My wife, he said, and stopped. The word felt like an underwater thing surfacing into air that's too bright. He swallowed it back. Never mind. Grace understood the never mind better than the half-confession. She had could-have-beens, too, the kind that live under beds waiting for you to turn off the light. Mr. Blake, she said, if you want me to put her back in the crib, I will. Now that she's settled, she might manage. Ethan stared at the star-shaped nightlight as if it were trying to sell him something. No, he said after a moment that felt brave. Let her sleep like that, for tonight. Then, because he couldn't not reclaim the high ground. But this isn't a precedent. Understood. He lingered at the doorway. The snow made the hallway a pallid mirror. Margaret spoke highly of you, he said. I hired you because she rarely does. Grace nodded, surprised by the thread of warmth that sentence carried. Margaret is good. Ethan's gaze flicked to the badge clipped to Grace's sweater. Grace. He tasted the name as if checking it for hidden clauses. Grace, you will find that I am not unkind, but I am precise. There is a difference. I know, she said. Precision can be a kind of mercy. He looked at her as if she'd said something she wasn't supposed to say aloud. Get some rest, he said, which wasn't an order and wasn't an apology and wasn't a benediction, but carried a small echo of all three. Then he turned and left the way he'd come, on quiet feet. The door closed. The nightlight made its small galaxy again. Grace's shoulders softened by careful degrees. She breathed with Sophie, calibration by calibration until both rhythms matched. The ceiling mobile spun, the paper bear circling the paper moon. She tilted her head back and let the wall take some of her weight. She thought about the day she'd come to Greenwood with a canvas bag and a past she'd told no one, about the orientation packet that had told her how to fold towels and address the chef, about the unspoken rule that you do not, ever, love the child who isn't yours. Too late, she thought, closing her eyes. She was already caught, not by the mansion, not by the title of the man who paid her, but by a pair of small hands that had learned the map of her cardigan and a voice that said Gracie, like a lifeboat. Down the hall a clock chimed, 2, maybe 3. The wind pushed, the house held. Grace shifted so Sophie's head would not crick in sleep. She watched the star on the wall and, without meaning to, slipped for a moment into a thin slice of dream in which the house was smaller and warmer, the floors were scarred wood, the windows were candles, and family meant something simple, a hand reaching for yours in the dark and finding it, every time. When she woke, it was to a quieter kind of silence, the kind morning makes before it's announced itself. She listened. Somewhere below, the kitchen clicked into life. The storm had spent itself into a soft, forgiving sky. Sophie sighed and burrowed closer. Grace smiled into the child's hair. The door stood closed, but it felt different now, as if the house had admitted a new rule it didn't fully understand yet. That presence is a kind of architecture. You build it with the body first. Later, you learn to build it with the soul. She didn't know that within 48 hours, she would be in a Boston boardroom with Ethan Blake himself asking her, of all people, to help build a thing grander than a house. She didn't know that the name Unity Link would land between them like a bridge no one had taught them to cross. She only knew the present tense, the warmth of a child, the soft diminishing of a storm, the bare beginning of a story she hadn't planned to enter, until she had no choice but to keep walking. Grace traced a fingertip along the seam of the blanket and whispered the simplest promise she knew, the one she had never been given and therefore had learned to make without condition. "I'm here," she said into the stillness. "I'm not going anywhere." And for the first time in a very long time, the house believed her. The snowstorm had given way to a brittle blue morning, the kind that made every frost-edged branch look carved from glass. In most of Greenwood Estate, the staff moved like clock hands, measured, precise, invisible. But in the nursery, time had its own rhythm, dictated by one small girl who refused to follow any schedule but her own. Grace Miller had already tidied the toy chest twice and straightened Sophie's bookshelf 3 times that day. Each time she thought the child had finally drifted off, a faint rustle or whimper would pull her back to the bedside. This was day 16 in the house. 16 days of learning Sophie's language, one spoken in silences, shivers, and sudden clinging. 16 nights of lullabies that rarely reached their end before the little girl's eyes fluttered open again. Margaret Thompson, the senior housekeeper, found her just after lunch, bent over Sophie's bed with the patience of a saint. "You'll wear yourself thin," Margaret said, arms folded, her neatly pressed apron crisp against the navy of her uniform. Her voice was not unkind, but it carried the weight of years in service to this house. Grace kept her hand lightly over Sophie's back. "She won't sleep on her own. Not yet." "She didn't before you came either," Margaret replied. "The difference is—" She stopped herself, glancing toward the half-closed door. "The difference is, she's quieter now. But you'll have to accept what Mr. Blake will not, that the child sets the terms, not the schedule." Grace smiled faintly. "That sounds like you're telling me to do what I'm already doing." "I'm telling you to survive here," Margaret said, softening. "Ethan Blake is a man of systems. If he sees you as part of the system, you'll last. If he sees you as an exception..." She let the thought hang. Exceptions don't stay long at Greenwood. That night, the storm had passed, but Sophie's restlessness remained. The snow outside glowed faintly under a three-quarter moon. Grace had drawn the heavy drapes to make the room feel smaller, safer. She settled into the rocking chair by the bed, humming almost without thinking. It was the same song she'd hummed the night before. "You Are My Sunshine," the lullaby she'd learned in a foster home in Worcester when she was 9. Back then, it had been sung by a tired caseworker with a good voice and kind eyes. A woman who left 3 weeks later and was never heard from again. Grace remembered clinging to the sound more than the words. "Gracie?" Sophie's small voice broke through the hum. "Yes, honey?" "Can you do the Sunshine song again? The whole thing?" Grace began softly, the melody a gentle thread through the dark. Her voice wasn't polished, but it was steady, warm. By the second verse, Sophie's eyelids had begun their slow descent. Grace let her hand rest against the child's hair, feeling each tiny breath. What she didn't know was that they weren't alone. From the hallway, Ethan Blake stood just beyond the door frame, one hand on the edge of the jamb. He had meant to check in on the nightly routine, make sure the house rules were being followed, reassure himself that the regimen he'd approved was in place. But what met him instead was a sound he hadn't heard in this house for years. It wasn't the song. He'd heard lullabies before, from nannies with perfect resumes and impressive credentials. It was the unpolished intimacy of it. The way Grace's voice seemed to meet Sophie where she was, instead of trying to pull her toward some artificial calm. He watched Sophie's small face relax, the tension in her jaw loosening, her hands uncurling under the blanket. Grace finished the song and simply sat there, not rushing to leave, not looking at a watch. Something in Ethan's chest shifted. Unwelcome, unfamiliar. He turned away before Grace could notice him, retreating down the hall toward his office. Back in the nursery, Grace waited until Sophie's breathing settled into the deep, even rhythm of true sleep. She stood carefully, easing the blanket higher under the girl's chin. For a moment, she just looked. At the curve of Sophie's cheek, the way the nightlight's glow pooled in her hair, the faint smile that came only in sleep. She didn't know how long she'd be in this house, or what Ethan Blake truly thought of her. But she knew one thing as sure as the snow outside. Sophie slept when she felt safe, and for now that safety was in her arms, in her voice. Grace stepped back, her shadow gliding over the wall. She whispered into the stillness, almost as if she were making a promise to herself. "We'll get there, little one night at a time." The storm had passed, but Greenwood Estate still carried the silence that follows weather, a hush that seemed to seep into the walls. Grace had finished the morning routine in the nursery. Sophie's hair brushed and tied with a pale blue ribbon, the bookshelf dusted, the wooden blocks stacked neatly along the wall. It was just after noon when Margaret appeared at the doorway, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Blake wants to see you," she said. In the study, Grace's first thought was, what did I do wrong? The reflex of someone who'd spent years knowing that being called into a closed-door meeting rarely meant anything good. She found Ethan's study on the west side of the house, where sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling windows across a long mahogany desk. The room was a blend of old and new. Oil paintings of New England coastlines alongside sleek monitors glowing with charts and schematics. Ethan was seated behind the desk. Sleeves rolled, the top button of his shirt undone, a rare sign of loosened formality. He gestured to the leather chair opposite him. "Sit." Grace did, folding her hands in her lap. "Is something wrong?" "That depends on your answer to what I'm about to say." He leaned back slightly, studying her as if she were a puzzle piece he hadn't yet decided belonged in the picture. I have a project, Unity Link. It's a mobile platform designed to connect single mothers with local support, childcare, legal aid, medical services. Right now it's in the prototype phase. Grace blinked. That's impressive. But why are you telling me? Because I want you to join the advisory group. The words landed with the weight of something she hadn't expected to hear in her lifetime, let alone from a man who'd scolded her for sitting on the nursery floor only 2 nights earlier. I think you might have the wrong person, she said carefully. I'm not in tech. I've never built an app. I don't even have the right vocabulary for this kind of work. Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk. You have something more valuable than technical jargon. You understand the people this app is supposed to serve. Grace shook her head, unsure whether to laugh or argue. You're talking about mothers. I'm not a mother. No, he said. But you've lived in the gap this project is trying to fill. You've seen what happens when there's no safety net. That perspective is exactly what I need in the room when decisions are made. She hesitated. The part of her that was still the girl from foster care wanted to say yes instantly, wanted to believe she could be more than the help. But another part of her, the one that had learned survival by staying in her lane, whispered caution. I'd only consider it, she said slowly, if my input carried the same weight as anyone else's. I'm not here to be a token voice you can quote in a press release. Something flickered in Ethan's expression. Maybe surprise, maybe respect. Agreed. Equal weight. She exhaled. Then I'll do it. He nodded once, decisive. Good. The first meeting is in Boston next week. I'll have Margaret adjust your schedule. Grace rose to leave, still unsure how this had happened, still half expecting him to change his mind. At the door, Ethan spoke again, his tone quieter. For what it's worth, Grace, I don't hand out seats at that table easily. She met his gaze, trying to read what he wasn't saying. Then I'll try to make it worth your while. When she stepped back into the hallway, Margaret was waiting, a rare hint of a smile at the corners of her mouth. That was quick, she said. Grace let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. I think I just agreed to something I don't fully understand. Margaret's smile widened just slightly. Welcome to Greenwood. The week leading up to the Unity Link meeting felt like the air before a summer storm. Charged, unpredictable. Ethan's team in Boston had been fine-tuning presentation decks, user interface demos, and market projections. Grace had been quietly preparing in her own way, jotting down stories from the women she'd met in shelters, the questions that kept mothers awake at night, the gaps no glossy pitch could hide. The meeting was scheduled in a sleek, glass-walled conference space in downtown Boston, high above the wintry streets. The view from the windows was all sharp angles and frozen river, but inside the hum of ambition filled the air. Grace sat at one end of the long table, the only person without a laptop open. She'd brought a simple notebook, its pages lined with careful handwriting. Across from her sat Bradford Cole, Ethan's chief operating officer, tailored suit, perfect Windsor knot. A smile just shy of sincere. The meeting had barely begun when Ethan's phone lit up with a notification. He glanced at the screen, his brow tightening. We'll need to pause for 5 minutes, he said, his voice calm but edged. There's been an incident. The incident unfolded in pieces. A reporter had contacted the company's PR team, claiming to have proof that Unity Link's beta user data had been leaked. Names, addresses, even confidential requests for help. It was the kind of breach that could destroy trust before the project even launched. Grace felt the blood drain from her face. Do we know how it happened? Not yet, Ethan replied. His gaze swept the room, pausing for the briefest moment on Bradford, who was studiously tapping his pen against his notebook. As the meeting broke into smaller side conversations, Grace found herself in the corner with Ethan. "Do you think it's internal?" she asked quietly. His answer was measured. "Let's just say, Bradford has been ambitious in ways that don't always align with my vision." Before Grace could ask more, Ethan's tone shifted, softer. "There's something you should know, Grace. Something I haven't talked about outside my family." He looked past her for a moment, as though weighing whether to open a door that had been locked for years. "Sophie's mother, Amanda, she struggled with postpartum depression. I didn't see it soon enough. By the time I realized how bad it was, we were already unraveling. Unity Link isn't just a business to me, it's..." He stopped, his jaw tightening. "It's the thing I wish had existed back then." Grace heard the truth in his voice, the kind that makes a person's eyes look older for a moment. "That's why you're doing this," she said gently. Ethan gave a single nod. "Yes. And why we can't afford to let anyone turn it into a weapon." That afternoon, as Grace was leaving the building, her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. She answered cautiously. "Grace Miller?" The voice was female, cool, and unmistakably self-assured. "This is Amanda Ross." Grace stopped walking. She could hear the city around her, car horns, the distant wail of a siren, but the name had cleared all other noise from her head. "I'd like to see my daughter," Amanda continued. "Soon, somewhere neutral." Grace hesitated. "I think that's something you should talk to Ethan about." "I will," Amanda said. "But I wanted to talk to you first. You're the one she trusts, and that means you're the one standing between us." Before Grace could respond, the line went dead. She stood on the sidewalk, the wind slicing cold against her cheeks, the shadows of Boston's towers stretching long across the snow. Somewhere deep down, she knew this was only the beginning, that Amanda's return would shake more than just Sophie's world. The Boston Public Garden was still half buried under winter. Snow crusted the edges of the frozen pond, where a lone swan boat sat tethered, its painted neck arched toward a sky the color of pewter. The skeletal branches of elms rattled in the wind, and the paths were mostly empty except for the occasional bundled couple or a runner with a cloud of breath trailing behind. Grace stood near the bronze make-way for duckling statues, Sophie's mittened hand tucked in hers. The little girl's boots crunched softly on the packed snow as they waited. Grace had told Sophie only that they were meeting a friend of your dad's, careful to avoid planting fears before the moment came. Ethan had agreed to the meeting under tight conditions: public space, daytime, and Grace present the entire time. He stood a short distance away now, his dark wool coat blending into the trees, eyes scanning every movement in the park. Amanda Ross arrived like a change in the air, slender, impeccably dressed in a camel coat and silk scarf, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders. She carried no purse, no gift, only a faint scent of expensive perfume that did not belong in this frozen park. Her smile was tentative. "Hi, Sophie." Sophie pressed closer to Grace's leg. She didn't answer. "It's okay," Grace murmured, crouching so they were at eye level. "This is Amanda." Amanda's gaze flickered to Grace, a flash of something, gratitude perhaps, or annoyance, that vanished as quickly as it came. She knelt, her gloved hands resting lightly on her knees. "You've grown," she said softly. "Last time I saw you, you were just a baby." Sophie's eyes were wide, wary. "Can we go home, Gracie?" The question pierced the winter air. Grace felt it in her chest before she answered. "Soon, honey. Just a little longer." Amanda's smile faltered. She stood and turned slightly toward Ethan, who had stepped closer. "She doesn't even remember me." "You've been gone a long time," Ethan said evenly. "That's not her fault." Amanda exhaled, a puff of steam in the cold. "I thought maybe if she saw me, something would click. But clearly—" Her eyes shifted back to Grace, and this time the emotion was unmasked. "You've taken my place." Grace's instinct was to deny it, to soften the blow. But Sophie's hand was still in hers, gripping tighter now, and the truth was complicated. "I've just been here," Grace said quietly. "That's all." Amanda looked down at the child again, something like longing in her face. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to undo what happened, but I need you to know," she looked at Ethan, "that the circles you move in, the people you trust, they will never accept her." Her chin lifted toward Grace. "Not in your home, not in your boardroom, not in your world." The words hung in the air like frost, sharp and stinging. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Amanda stepped back, as if distance could soften the moment. "I'll be in touch," she said, and without waiting for an answer, she turned and walked down the path, her figure growing smaller between the rows of trees until the wind and snow swallowed her completely. Sophie tugged on Grace's coat. "Can we go home now?" Grace smiled faintly and squeezed her hand. "Yes, honey. Let's go home." As they walked toward Ethan, Grace felt the weight of Amanda's warning settle somewhere deep. She didn't believe it, not fully, but she understood that the path ahead would not be smooth, and for Sophie's sake, she would walk it anyway. The invitation to New York arrived not as a request, but as an itinerary slid across the kitchen counter while Grace was helping Sophie finish her breakfast. Ethan's voice was neutral, as if the decision had already been set in stone. "You'll need to be in Manhattan for 2 days," he said, pouring coffee into a travel mug. "UnityLink's Investor Council meets on Thursday morning at Grayson HQ." Grace looked up from cutting Sophie's pancakes into quarters. "You want me there?" "I need you there," Ethan corrected. "The advisory team's input is going to shape how the investors view our next round. If they don't believe UnityLink has a human heart at its center, they'll see it as just another line on a balance sheet." Grace set down the knife. "And you think I'm the one who can convince them?" Ethan met her eyes briefly, something like conviction in his expression. "I know you are." The trip to New York was Sophie's first time on the Acela Express. Grace sat with her by the window, watching the winter coastline blur past, while Ethan worked on his laptop 2 rows ahead. Sophie pressed her face to the glass, tracing the shapes of frozen marshes and steepled towns with her mittened hand. When they pulled into Penn Station, the city greeted them with its usual clamor: taxi horns, the metallic screech of brakes, the gusts of wind funneled through avenues. Grayson HQ rose 26 stories above Madison Avenue, its glass facade reflecting the brittle winter sunlight. The building's lobby was a cathedral of modern ambition: polished marble floors, a digital waterfall wall scrolling the company's milestones, and security gates that clicked open with the flash of an ID badge. Grace felt the shift in the air immediately. This was not Greenwood Estate. Here, every second counted, and every glance measured. Bradford Cole was waiting at the security desk, his smile practiced, his handshake cool. "Welcome to New York, Grace," he said, his tone laced with something she couldn't quite place. "Big day tomorrow." She nodded politely. "I'm ready." "Good," Bradford said, his gaze lingering a moment too long. "Let's make sure you stay that way." That evening, Ethan had arranged for Grace to have a small conference room to review her talking points. He'd explained that her role in the presentation was simple: share a 5-minute perspective on why UnityLink mattered to real people, grounded in her own experiences and the stories she'd heard. Grace sat at the long table, notebook open, pen poised, but her thoughts kept drifting. Amanda's warning from the public garden was still fresh in her mind. They will never accept you. She wondered how many of the men and women she'd face tomorrow would already see her as a liability rather than an asset. Just after 9, Ethan appeared in the doorway. "How's it coming?" She gave a small shrug. "I've been thinking more than writing." "That's fine," he said, stepping inside. "The best part of what you do isn't rehearsed." He leaned against the table, studying her face. "I can handle the numbers, the projections, the growth curves. What I can't do is make them feel something about UnityLink. That's why you're here." His confidence steadied her more than any note she'd written. She closed the notebook, choosing instead to sleep. Tomorrow, she decided, would not be about impressing anyone. It would be about telling the truth. The boardroom on the 24th floor was a glass-sided chamber with a view that made the Chrysler Building look almost within reach. The table was an enormous oval of black walnut, surrounded by high-backed chairs filled with men and women in tailored suits. Ethan began the meeting with a concise overview of UnityLink's milestones: early beta testing in 3 cities, partnerships with local nonprofits, the data showing that 78% of users found critical services within 24 hours of logging on. The investors nodded, occasionally typing notes, their expressions politely attentive. Then Ethan gestured toward her. "This," he said, "is Grace Miller, our strategic advisor. She's here because this project exists for people like her and the people she's worked alongside her whole life. And because she can tell you something I can't." All eyes turned to Grace. She felt the weight of it but kept her breathing steady. "I grew up in the foster care system here in Massachusetts," she began. "I aged out at 18 with no family, no safety net, and no clear path forward. Over the years, I've met countless women, single mothers, who were facing not just the absence of help, but the absence of a way to find it. That's the gap UnityLink is trying to close." She told them about a mother in Dorchester who'd been sleeping in her car with a newborn because the shelter waitlist was 3 weeks long. About another in Worcester who had to choose between paying for daycare or keeping her apartment. She spoke without reading from her notes, letting the images stand on their own. "When you invest in UnityLink," she concluded, "you're not just funding an app. You're giving someone the bridge they can't build alone. And sometimes that bridge is the difference between a family breaking apart and a family staying whole." For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint hum of the HVAC. Then one of the older investors, a woman with silver hair and sharp blue eyes, nodded. "That," she said, "is why I'm here." The energy in the room shifted. Questions followed. Sharper now, but directed toward possibilities rather than doubts. Ethan handled the technical and financial queries. Grace fielded questions about outreach, trust building, and on-the-ground implementation. When the meeting adjourned, several investors stopped to shake her hand. Even Bradford, whose smile was as tight as ever, offered a clipped, "Well done." But as the day wound down, Grace noticed something that made her skin prickle. In the lounge outside the boardroom, a young man in a Grayson HQ security badge was leaning over her laptop, closed when she'd left it. She caught the faintest glimpse of a USB drive being slid from the port before he turned, startled at her approach. "Oh, sorry, ma'am," he said quickly. "Just making sure the table was cleared for the next meeting." He slipped the drive into his pocket and walked briskly toward the elevators. Grace's first instinct was to follow, but by the time she reached the hall, he was gone. She looked back toward the boardroom where Bradford was chatting with 2 investors, his hand resting casually in his pocket, eyes cutting briefly in her direction. Her stomach tightened. That evening, she met Ethan in the hotel lobby, the city's night pulse visible through the revolving doors. "How do you think it went today?" he asked. Grace hesitated. "I think the presentation went well, but something happened after the meeting." She told him about the man at her laptop, the USB drive, the way he disappeared into the elevators. Ethan's jaw hardened. "That's not standard procedure. You're sure about what you saw?" "I know the difference between tidying up and taking something," she said firmly. He nodded once, his mind already moving 3 steps ahead. "Bradford has been circling this project like a vulture for months. If he's trying to compromise Unity Link from the inside, I need to know now." Grace leaned in slightly. "Then we need to be careful. If he's willing to steal data, he's willing to do worse." Ethan's eyes met hers, the weight of agreement between them. "I'll have our cybersecurity team check the device logs tonight. In the meantime, don't leave your laptop unattended." Grace exhaled, feeling the hum of the city outside like a second heartbeat. The day had been a victory in the boardroom, but in the shadows, another game was already in play, and she had the sinking feeling that before long, Sophie would be caught in the middle of it. The morning after the investor meeting, Grayson HQ buzzed with the kind of manufactured calm that only comes when something is very wrong. Grace could feel it the moment she stepped off the elevator on the 15th floor, an undercurrent running through every clipped footstep and low-voiced conversation. She had brought Sophie to the office that day at Ethan's request. The plan was simple. While he finished a half-day of meetings, Grace would keep Sophie entertained in one of the private lounges before they all caught the train back to Boston together. The lounge was bright and quiet, with a picture window overlooking Madison Avenue. Sophie was playing with a set of magnetic tiles, building a small, lopsided castle while Grace answered a quick email on her phone. It couldn't have been more than 2 minutes, just long enough for Grace to reply, "Yes, I can help with the shelter fundraiser next month," when she looked up and Sophie was gone. At first, she assumed the girl had wandered into the adjoining kitchenette for a snack. "Sophie?" Grace called, her voice still light. No answer. She checked the kitchenette. Empty. The restroom? Empty. The hallway? Only strangers in business suits brushing past without a glance. Her pulse jumped. She circled back into the lounge, scanning every corner as if Sophie might somehow be hiding in plain sight. "Sophie!" she called again, louder this time. That was when she saw it. The small brown teddy bear Sophie carried everywhere, lying on its side near the elevator doors. Its stitched ear was bent the way it always was after Sophie clutched it in her sleep. The elevator display showed the last trip had been up, to the roof access level. Grace didn't think. She sprinted into the elevator, slamming the button for the top floor. Her heart hammered in time with the mechanical hum as the numbers climbed, 16, 17, 18. When the doors opened, a gust of winter air rushed in from the open roof access door at the end of the corridor. Grace ran. The rooftop was wide, edged with a low safety wall and a view that made the city feel both impossibly large and suddenly dangerous. And there, near the far corner, was Sophie, standing beside Bradford Cole. Grace's first thought was that Sophie looked too calm, almost confused, as if she didn't fully understand why she was there. Bradford was speaking to her in a low voice, one hand resting casually in his pocket, the other gesturing toward the skyline. "Bradford!" Grace's voice cracked the air between them. "Step away from her." He turned, his smile as smooth as glass. "Grace, relax. We were just getting some air." "You don't have clearance for this floor," she said, moving forward, her eyes never leaving Sophie. "I have clearance for a lot of things you don't know about," Bradford replied evenly. "Sophie and I were talking about her father's work. She's a bright kid, very curious about the future." Grace reached them and immediately crouched to Sophie's level. Sweetheart, come with me. Sophie's small hand slid into hers without hesitation. That tiny gesture, the ease of it, ignited something sharp in Grace. She stood, placing herself between Sophie and Bradford. If you want to discuss the future, Bradford, do it in the boardroom, not on a rooftop with a 7-year-old. His smile didn't falter, but his eyes cooled. Careful, Grace. You don't want to make enemies here. Not when you're already an anomaly. She didn't answer. Instead, she walked Sophie back toward the access door, her free hand gripping the teddy bear. By the time they reached the lobby, Ethan was striding toward them, his expression thunderous. Where have you... His voice cut off when he saw Sophie clutching Grace's arm, the wind-tangled hair, the flush in Grace's cheeks. She was on the roof, Grace said flatly. With Bradford. Ethan's face hardened into something that made nearby employees look away. Go to the car, he told Grace quietly. I'll handle this. In the SUV back to the hotel, Sophie sat in the middle seat, head resting against Grace's arm. The city lights streaked past the window, neon and halogen blurring into a restless glow. Gracie? Sophie's voice was small. Yes, honey? Bradford said Daddy might have to send you away. Grace's throat tightened. He was wrong. Sometimes people say things to scare you when they want something. What did he want? Grace hesitated. I'm not sure yet. But you don't have to worry. I'm not going anywhere without telling you first. Sophie nodded, satisfied for now, and turned her gaze back to the window. Back at the hotel, Ethan arrived half an hour later. He removed his coat and poured 2 glasses of water, handing one to Grace. Bradford claims he was giving Sophie a tour. He says you overreacted. Grace kept her voice steady. Then ask security for the access logs. He had no reason to be on that roof. And if you think this was innocent, I don't, Ethan interrupted. He sat heavily on the sofa, running a hand through his hair. Bradford's been with me for 7 years. I've overlooked a lot because he delivers results. But this... He exhaled slowly. This is different. Grace studied him. You think this was about me, about pushing me out? I think, Ethan said, that Bradford knows UnityLink has become personal for me, and that you're part of the reason why. That makes you a threat to his control. Grace thought of Amanda's warning in the public garden, the look in Bradford's eyes on the roof, the stolen moment with her laptop. He's not going to stop. Ethan's gaze was steady now. Then we won't either. The next morning, Grace awoke to find a note slipped under her hotel door in block-printed letters. Watch who you trust. No name, no signature. She folded it and slid it into her pocket, already knowing the fight ahead had just stepped into a higher gear. The day after Sophie's disappearance on the rooftop, the air in Greenwood Estate felt sharper, as though the walls themselves had been braced for impact. Ethan had said little during the ride back from New York, but Grace had seen the calculations turning in his head. Quick, ruthless, methodical. She suspected that whatever came next would not be a conversation. By mid-morning, he called her into his study. The curtains were open, letting in a cold wash of winter light over the mahogany desk. Sophie was upstairs with Margaret, and the house was otherwise silent. I've reviewed the building's security logs, Ethan began. Bradford accessed the roof without clearance. He used a guest pass registered to a contractor who hasn't worked for us in weeks. Grace wasn't surprised. Then you know this wasn't an accident. I do, Ethan said. And it's not the first irregularity. Our internal audit has flagged discrepancies in the UnityLink expense reports. Payments routed through shell accounts, software licenses purchased twice, that sort of thing. Grace leaned forward. He's bleeding the project. He's selling it, Ethan corrected, his tone like ice. We traced an encrypted transfer of beta user data to a competitor in Silicon Valley. They're building a parallel platform. Same core design, same outreach plan, and Bradford signed the access keys. Grace felt a surge of anger that steadied into something colder. So, what do we do? Ethan's eyes narrowed. We gather proof, enough to shut him down completely, not just fire him. I want him out of the boardroom and into a courtroom. That evening, Ethan called an emergency board session at the financial district offices in Boston. The room was glass-walled, overlooking the frozen harbor. The directors arrived in tailored coats and guarded expressions, each taking their place at the long table. Bradford was already there, his smile perfectly intact, as if he'd been expecting a different kind of meeting. Ethan opened with the numbers. UnityLink's performance metrics, the investor commitments from New York, the projected launch timeline. Then his tone shifted. Before we move forward, there's a matter of internal security we need to address. A faint ripple moved through the room. Bradford's smile didn't waver. Ethan tapped a key, and the wall screen lit up with a series of security stills. Bradford entering the roof access hall with Sophie, Bradford's login opening Grace's laptop, the time-stamped transfer of encrypted data to an unregistered IP. Bradford Cole, Ethan said evenly, you are hereby suspended from your role as Chief Operating Officer, effective immediately. An independent investigation will determine whether criminal charges will be filed. The boardroom went utterly silent. Bradford laughed once, a short, sharp sound. This is ridiculous. You think you can pin a data leak on me because of some out-of-context images? I've built this company's operations for 7 years. I have relationships with every major supplier you need. You take me out, you take a knife to your own throat. Ethan didn't blink. We can replace suppliers. We can't replace integrity. Bradford's gaze swept the room, searching for allies. A few directors shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. Grace, seated near the end of the table, felt the weight of his attention when it landed on her. And you, he said, his voice dropping. The Maid turned advisor. Do you really think you'll survive in this world once I'm gone? You're a novelty act, Grace, a feel-good story for the press. Without me balancing the equation, you'll be out of here within a month. She met his stare without flinching. If you think this is about me, you haven't been paying attention. It's about Sophie. It's about the mothers who'll use UnityLink, and it's about making sure no one else can turn their lives into leverage. For the first time, Bradford's smile cracked. The board voted to suspend him pending investigation. 2 security officers arrived to escort him out. As he passed Grace, he leaned just close enough for her to hear, "You haven't won. You've just moved to a bigger board." When the doors closed behind him, the room exhaled. Ethan turned to face the board. Effective immediately, Grace Miller will serve as strategic advisor for UnityLink in an official capacity, with full access to project decisions. A murmur moved through the directors, some approving, others skeptical. But no one challenged him. Ethan caught Grace's eye across the table. There was no smile, just a silent acknowledgement. The fight wasn't over, but the first battle was theirs. That night, back at Greenwood, Grace checked on Sophie before bed. The girl was asleep, one hand curled around her teddy bear. Grace stood in the doorway for a long moment, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing. Downstairs, Ethan was on the phone with legal counsel, already preparing the next steps. The house felt warmer than it had in weeks, but Grace knew Bradford's warning was still true in one way. The boardroom was only going to get more dangerous from here. It started with a headline: Boston Billionaire and the Former Maid. The words screamed from the front page of the city's most read business paper, flanked by a photo of Grace stepping out of Grayson HQ in New York. Sophie was in the frame, too, clutching her teddy bear. Her face turned into Grace's coat. By noon, it was everywhere, online, on TV, in the gossip columns. Commentators debated whether Ethan Blake had compromised corporate integrity by giving a former household staff member an executive advisory role. Others speculated about their relationship, some with thinly veiled sneers, others with open malice. Grace didn't need to read the full articles to feel the damage. Every time she stepped outside Greenwood Estate, cameras were waiting at the gate. Paparazzi shouted her name, asking loaded questions. She stopped going to the market, sending Margaret instead. The worst part wasn't for her, it was for Sophie. One afternoon, Grace was walking her from the car to the front door when a man with a camera crouched low at the driveway entrance, firing shots rapid fire. Sophie froze, clutching Grace's leg. "Who are they?" Sophie whispered. Grace bent down to meet her eyes. "Just people who don't understand us," she said softly. "Let's get inside." That evening, Grace sat at the kitchen table with a blank piece of stationery in front of her. She'd been thinking about it for days, writing a letter to Sophie, something the girl could read when she was older, to understand this moment without the distortion of the headlines. She wrote slowly, choosing each word with care. "Dear Sophie, if you ever read this, I want you to know something important. The world outside might call me names, make guesses, or tell stories that aren't true. But the truth is simple. I stayed because you needed me, and I'll keep staying, no matter what it costs." She folded the letter and slipped it into an envelope, tucking it into the drawer of her bedside table. The next morning, Ethan came into the kitchen with a printout in his hand. "You've seen this?" "I've seen enough," Grace replied. "They're not going to stop," he said. "Bradford's allies in the press are trying to force the board to question Unity Link's direction, and your place in it." Grace shook her head. "Then maybe I should step back. Let you launch without the distraction." Ethan's tone sharpened. "No. That's exactly what they want. And it's the last thing I'll allow." She looked at him, unsure if he was speaking as a CEO, a father, or something in between. "Then what's your plan?" 2 days later, Ethan called a press conference at a downtown hotel. The room was packed with reporters, the air hot with the hum of camera equipment. Grace stood just off stage, heart pounding, unsure what he'd say. Ethan stepped to the podium in a dark suit, his voice even but carrying a weight that silenced the crowd. Unity Link was built to solve a real problem, one that technology alone can't fix. To do it right, I needed more than coders and executives. I needed someone who understood the human side better than anyone I've met. That person is Grace Miller. A murmur moved through the room. She is not a charity case, Ethan continued, his gaze sweeping the crowd. She is the moral compass of this project. She is, in every meaningful way, Unity Link's co-founder. And she has my complete confidence. A reporter in the front row raised a hand. Are you saying she has an official equity stake? Yes, Ethan said simply. Effective today. The room buzzed with fresh questions, but Ethan didn't take them. He left the podium, crossing to where Grace stood. For a moment, he let the cameras capture them in the same frame, not as employer and employee, but as partners in something larger than either of them alone. That night, the headlines shifted. Some still questioned the decision, but others reframed it. Blake names former Maid co-founder of Unity Link from nursery floor to boardroom. The Grace Miller story. Grace didn't care about the words so much as the quiet they brought to Greenwood. For the first time in weeks, the front gate was free of cameras. Sophie played in the snow without looking over her shoulder. But Grace knew the storm hadn't passed completely. It had only moved higher into the clouds, where bigger battles were waiting. The first snow of February had settled gently over East Boston, softening the brick and concrete into something almost tender. Grace stood at the entrance of a refurbished brick building, its wide front windows glowing with warm light against the winter dusk. Above the door, in freshly painted lettering, was the name she had fought for: Warm Steps Foundation. Inside, the air smelled faintly of new wood and fresh coffee. The space was open, with cozy corners of overstuffed chairs, shelves lined with children's books, and a play area dotted with bright rugs. Along one wall stood a bank of computer stations for job searches and resource access. Along another, a small clinic room for on-site medical consultations. Women of every background moved through the space, some with children on their hips, some alone but carrying a different kind of weight. Volunteers greeted them by name, offering hot meals, warm coats, and a place to rest without judgment. Grace moved among them with quiet purpose, checking in, listening, introducing them to staff. She paused at the reception desk where a young woman was filling out intake forms. Grace recognized her. Tanya, a former assistant at a tech firm who had been blacklisted after reporting financial fraud. "I didn't think anyone would hire me again," Tanya admitted. "You're not here to beg for a job," Grace said gently. "You're here to start again. We'll help you find the next door to open." Tanya's eyes brimmed, and Grace squeezed her hand before moving on. At the back of the room, Ethan was kneeling to help Sophie zip up her coat. The little girl was flushed from playing with a group of children in the reading corner, her curls escaping from beneath a knit hat. When she spotted Grace, Sophie bounded over, holding up a paper crown decorated with stickers. "I made this for you." Grace crouched down, letting Sophie place the crown on her head. "Perfect fit," she said, smiling. Ethan straightened, his gaze taking in the scene around them. "You built this," he said quietly. "We built this," Grace corrected. He glanced toward the clinic room where a nurse was examining a toddler while the mother watched with visible relief. "UnityLink is going to partner with Warm Steps," he said. "Every woman who walks through this door will have access to the same network we're building online. No one gets lost in the gaps." Grace's throat tightened. That was always the dream. Near the entrance, a small crowd began to gather for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Local reporters adjusted their cameras. City officials took their places. Ethan stepped to the microphone first, speaking briefly about the project's mission. Then he handed the mic to Grace. She hesitated for a moment, looking out at the faces, some curious, some hopeful, some hardened by years of surviving. "I grew up knowing what it feels like to have nowhere to land," she began. "This place is here so that no one, no child, no parent, ever has to feel that way again. Warm Steps is more than a building. It's a promise. A promise that you are seen, you are heard, and you are not alone." Applause swelled, filling the room with warmth that had nothing to do with the radiators. Grace took the oversized scissors from Sophie and, with Ethan's hand resting briefly over hers, cut the ribbon. Later, as the evening wound down and the guests drifted out into the snowy street, Grace stood by the window watching flakes settle on the sidewalk. Ethan came to stand beside her, Sophie drowsy in his arms. "You know," he said, "when I found you on the nursery floor that first night, I thought you were breaking the rules. Turns out you were just building a new one." Grace smiled, her gaze on Sophie's sleeping face. "Family isn't about where you start. It's about where you choose to stay." Ethan nodded, and for a moment the three of them simply stood together in the quiet, the foundation of something stronger than any storm that had come before. Outside, The sign above the door glowed against the snow. Warm Steps Foundation, a name that now belonged to all of them. And that's how a quiet act on a nursery floor became the first step towards something much greater. Unity Link, the Warm Steps Foundation, and a family that was chosen, not born. Grace, Ethan, and Sophie didn't just weather the storms that came their way. They built a home strong enough to shelter others too. If you've stayed with us until this very last moment, thank you from the bottom of my heart for walking through every twist, every trial, and every triumph with them. Your time here means more than you know. If this story touched you, I'd love to have you join our little storytelling family. Go ahead and hit subscribe so you won't miss the next journey we take together. Until then, stay warm, stay kind, and keep believing in the power of chosen family.